When I felt his hand brush against mine, I knew my life would never be the same. What happens when a single moment of weakness threatens to unravel everything you've built? Stick around to see how one forbidden night set off a chain reaction that changed everything. Make sure to subscribe for more captivating stories like this one, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and longing. Every time I saw Luca in the office, my heart would race, and I would catch myself wondering if he remembered that kiss the way I did. It felt like an unspoken secret between us, one we were both careful to keep buried beneath the surface of our professional lives. But the tension was always there, simmering beneath our every interaction. It was a week later when I found myself in that same bar again. I had gone to grab a drink after work, telling myself it was just to unwind, to forget about everything that had happened. But when I walked in, there he was, sitting at the same booth, looking just as effortlessly magnetic as the first time I saw him. "Luca," I said a little breathlessly as I approached, "I didn't expect to see you here." He looked up, a smile curling at the corners of his lips. "Well, you know what they say about coincidences." His gaze lingered on me, and I felt my pulse quicken. I could feel the air thickening between us, and for a moment I almost turned around and left, but something inside me, something I couldn't explain, pulled me toward him. I slid into the booth across from him. "I didn't come here for this," I said, my voice trembling despite my best effort to remain composed. "You didn't come here for what?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of amusement and something darker. "You know what I mean," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. Luca leaned forward, his face just inches from mine. "I know exactly what you mean." His hand brushed mine, sending a spark of heat up my arm. "But you came anyway." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the space between us had collapsed, and all I could hear was the thumping of my heart. All I could feel was the pull toward him, irresistible, dangerous. Before I could stop myself, I found myself leaning forward. This time there was no hesitation. Our lips met in a kiss that was hungry, desperate. His hands cupped my face, pulling me closer, and I couldn't help but melt into him. It wasn't just passion, it was something deeper, something that felt like it could destroy me. When we finally broke apart, I gasped for air, my body aching with the intensity of what had just transpired. Luca's eyes were dark, intense. He looked at me as if he had won something, as if he knew exactly what he had done to me. "I told you it was dangerous," he murmured, "but you couldn't stay away." I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, and in that moment I didn't care. I wanted him, wanted this connection, this fire that had sparked between us. It didn't matter that it was wrong. It didn't matter that I was married. I was trapped in this dangerous game now, and I didn't know how to get out. Climax. The following week, everything escalated. We couldn't keep our hands off each other. The stolen moments between us became more frequent, quick touches in the hallways, lingering glances across the office. Every time I looked at Luca, I felt a surge of desire that I couldn't control. I felt myself slipping deeper into him, further away from my life, from my husband. It happened late one night in the office. We were the only two left, working on separate projects. I was sitting at my desk when I felt the familiar presence of Luca behind me. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. His hands rested on the back of my chair, and I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Without turning around, I whispered, "Luca, we can't keep doing this. It's not right." His voice was soft but insistent. "But you want it, don't you? You want me just as much as I want you." I felt his breath on my neck, and despite myself, I shivered. "I do," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "But it's wrong." He moved in closer, pressing his chest against my back. "Sometimes the things that are most wrong feel the most right," he whispered. "Don't you feel that too?" His lips brushed the side of my neck, sending a wave of heat through my body. I felt my resolve starting to crumble, the need for him overwhelming everything else. I turned to face him, and before I could even think, his mouth was on mine again, this time harder, deeper. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer to him, and I responded without thinking, my body betraying me. I knew this was crossing a line, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. As our kiss deepened, I felt the weight of everything, my marriage, my guilt, my desire, all crashing together. But in that moment, I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was Luca, his body pressing against mine, his hands exploring my skin. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our bodies tangled together, and I knew I couldn't hide from this anymore. Confrontation. The next day, I was a mess. I tried to focus on my work, but every time I glanced at Luca, I felt a burning sensation between us, a tension that could no longer be ignored. I should have stopped it, should have walked away, but I couldn't. I was addicted to him. And then everything came crashing down. Ethan came to my office that afternoon. He'd never visited me at work, so it caught me off guard. He looked at me, his eyes searching, as if he knew something was wrong. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice quiet. I tried to smile, but it felt forced. "Yeah, just a long day." He didn't seem convinced. "Is something going on? You've been distant lately." My heart pounded. I had never been a good liar, and I could see the suspicion in Ethan's eyes. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on my desk. I glanced at it, and my stomach sank. It was a text from Luca. "I can't stop thinking about you." I froze. Ethan saw my expression, and without another word, he picked up my phone. The words on the screen were clear. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at me, his face hardening with a mix of hurt and confusion. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "I don't understand," Ethan said quietly, his voice breaking. "How long has this been going on?" Resolution. The silence in the room felt suffocating. Ethan stood there, staring at me with a look I had never seen before, a combination of betrayal, disbelief, and pain. I knew that everything was falling apart. "I never meant for it to happen," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It was a mistake." But I couldn't stop myself. Ethan shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. "You couldn't stop yourself? What happened to us, to our marriage?" I felt a pang of guilt shoot through me. I had betrayed him, and now the consequences were unfolding in front of me. "We can fix this," I said, reaching out for him. "Please, just let me explain." But Ethan stepped back, his face a mask of anguish. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this." Reflection and finale. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Ethan and I were no longer the couple we once were. The trust had been shattered, and while we tried to rebuild, there was a distance between us that could never be bridged. Luca and I stopped seeing each other, but the damage had already been done. I would never forget the way his body had spoken to mine, the way we crossed every boundary, and how it all fell apart because of it. But in some twisted way, I realized that I had needed it. The passion, the connection, the escape from the life I had built. It was something I could never get back. And now I had to live with the consequences of my choices. As I looked in the mirror one night, I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. She was a stranger now, a woman who had crossed every line and lost everything in the process. And I didn't know how to fix it. Would you like me to continue to the next 1,000 words or adjust anything in this segment? Let me know your thoughts. Absolutely. Let's continue with the next 1,000 words. This part will delve into the aftermath of the confrontation, the emotional fallout, and the repercussions of the affair. As the tension builds, the consequences start to weigh heavily on everyone involved. Oh. Part 3. The aftermath, emotional consequences, and unraveling. Aftermath. The days that followed the confrontation with Ethan were like walking through fog. Each step felt uncertain, each moment a reminder of the destruction I had caused. Ethan and I barely spoke. There was a coldness between us that neither of us knew how to break. At work, I couldn't even look Luca in the eye. I had gone from wanting him, craving him, to feeling nothing but regret and shame. It was as if the once invincible connection we shared had been shattered in an instant. Every glance we exchanged now felt like a reminder of my betrayal, not just of Ethan, but of myself. And yet, I couldn't entirely let go of the pull I felt toward him. There was a part of me that wanted to reach out, to pick up where we left off, to see if there was still that magnetic force between us. But I knew that would only make things worse. I had already lost everything I cared about. What more could I ruin? In the evenings, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my choices pressing down on me. Ethan had tried to talk to me once, asking if I wanted to work things out, if we could try to rebuild our marriage, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. How could I, after everything that had happened? How could I look him in the eye when I knew I had crossed a line that I could never uncross? And then there was Luca. He still worked in the office, still maintained his charm, his aloofness, but he never sought me out anymore. He never texted, never called. It was like I no longer existed to him, a casualty of our reckless moment together. His absence only reminded me of how small I had become in the grand scheme of things. The fiery passion between us had burned out, and all that was left was the residue of shame and brokenness. Emotional consequences. I began to feel the full weight of what I had done. My interactions with Ethan became strained. I could see the hurt in his eyes every time we spoke, the lingering pain that couldn't be erased by empty apologies. I had torn apart the foundation of our relationship, and no matter how hard I tried to make things right, it felt like a futile effort. One evening, as I was sorting through some old photos in the living room, Ethan came in and sat beside me. His face was unreadable, his features tight with emotion. "I don't know what to do with this, with us," he said quietly. His voice cracked. I looked up at him, tears welling in my eyes. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to happen like this. It was a mistake, a huge mistake." He shook his head slowly, his eyes distant. "I don't know if I can forgive you, not right now. I can't understand how this happened. How could you betray me like this?" His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had betrayed him. There was no sugarcoating it. I had crossed a line, and now I had to live with the consequences. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I wish I could explain it, but I don't think I understand it myself." Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he just stood up and walked away, leaving me alone in the room, drowning in guilt and self-loathing. It was then that I realized the extent of my actions. I hadn't just hurt Ethan, I had hurt myself too. The guilt that gnawed at me wasn't something I could escape. It was a shadow that clung to me, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. Unraveling. The days that followed were marked by silence. Ethan and I continued to share a home, but it felt like we were strangers, passing in the hallways, never truly connecting. I tried to go about my daily routines, tried to hold everything together, but it was impossible. The weight of my infidelity, the unspoken tension between us, made every day feel like a chore. Luca, too, had become an elusive figure. We hadn't spoken since that last night in the office. I had expected him to reach out, to demand answers, or perhaps try to reignite the affair, but nothing came. It was as if he had vanished from my life entirely. One afternoon, as I was leaving work early, I saw him outside the building. He was leaning against his car, looking as relaxed as ever, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. He didn't see me at first, so I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I approach him? Should I try to explain myself? Or should I just leave it all behind and move on? But before I could decide, Luca turned and saw me standing there. "Hey," he said, his voice low but friendly, as if nothing had happened. His eyes were cool, detached, and I couldn't tell if he was hiding anything behind that mask of indifference. "Have you been?" I swallowed, unsure of how to respond. "I've been okay." For a moment, neither of us said anything. I could feel the air thick with the history between us, the unspoken words hanging between us like a storm waiting to break. Finally, Luca spoke again, his tone softer this time. "I think it's best if we don't see each other anymore. It's too messy." His words stung more than I anticipated. I had known this was coming. This was the logical end. But hearing him say it out loud, so calmly, so final, felt like a sharp knife in my chest. "I understand," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. I never should have let it go this far." Luca didn't say anything else. He just turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty parking lot. Finale. The next few weeks passed in a blur of emotion and uncertainty. Ethan and I tried to talk, tried to find a way to heal, but it was clear that we were no longer the same people we had been before. The trust was gone, and with it, a piece of what we had built together. I had lost the man I loved, the man who had been my partner for so long. And for what? A fleeting moment of passion, a reckless mistake? I knew the answer, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. As the weeks turned into months, I began to find a fragile peace within myself. I could never undo what I had done, but I had to learn to live with the consequences. I had to find a way forward, even if it meant walking alone. And in the quiet moments, when I was by myself, I would sometimes think about Luca, about the way his body had spoken to mine, the way we had crossed every boundary, every line. I would never forget the fire we shared, but I also knew that it was a fire that had burned everything to the ground. In the end, I realized that sometimes the most passionate moments are the ones that leave the deepest scars. And while those scars might never fully heal, they would serve as a reminder of the choices I had made and the person I had become because of them. The days following that kiss felt like a fever dream. I couldn't shake the memory of his lips on mine, the heat of his body, and the way the world had fallen away, leaving just the two of us suspended in time. At work, every glance he threw my way sent shivers down my spine, a silent reminder of what had transpired between us. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, but we both knew that something had shifted, something dangerous and irrevocable. One evening, as the office began to empty out and the shadows of twilight seeped into the building, I found myself lingering. I told myself it was to finish some paperwork, but deep down, I knew I was waiting for him. The familiar sound of his footsteps approached, and I didn't even have to turn around to know it was him. My heart quickened as he leaned against the edge of my desk. "You're still here," he said, his voice low and smooth. I looked up, trying to keep my composure. "I could say the same about you." He smiled, but there was something predatory about it, something that made me both nervous and exhilarated. "You didn't answer my text earlier." I swallowed hard, remembering the message he had sent hours ago. "Can't stop thinking about you." I had deleted it immediately, afraid Ethan might see it. Now, face to face with Luca, the weight of my actions bore down on me. I didn't know what to say, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darkened and he leaned closer. "You don't have to say anything." Before I could process his words, he reached out, his fingers brushing against my wrist. The touch was electric, setting every nerve in my body alight. I should have pulled away, but instead I found myself leaning into him, drawn by a force I couldn't resist. In a heartbeat, he closed the distance between us. His lips captured mine in a kiss that was deeper, more urgent than the first. My resolve crumbled as I melted into him, my hands gripping the edge of the desk to steady myself. The world outside that room ceased to exist. All that mattered was the heat between us, the intoxicating pull of his presence. His hands found their way to my waist, and he lifted me effortlessly onto the desk. The cold surface sent a jolt through me, grounding me in the reality of what was happening. But even that wasn't enough to stop me. His lips trailed down my neck, and I let out a soft gasp, my fingers tangling in his. "This is crazy," I murmured, even as I tilted my head to give him better access. "Crazy," he agreed, his breath hot against my skin. "But it feels so right." I didn't have a response for that because he was right. It did feel right. More right than anything had in years. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about Ethan or the life I had built with him. All I could think about was Luca and the way he made me feel alive. The sound of a door closing somewhere down the hall jolted us apart. My heart pounded as I scrambled off the desk, smoothing down my skirt and trying to regain my composure. Luca took a step back, running a hand through his hair as he let out a low chuckle. "We're going to get caught if we keep this up," he said, though there was no hint of regret in his voice. "We can't do this," I said, though the words felt hollow even to me. He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "But we already have." Over the next few weeks, our affair deepened. It started with stolen moments in the office, quick kisses in the break room, whispered conversations in the stairwell. But it wasn't long before those moments weren't enough. We began meeting outside of work, finding excuses to see each other whenever we could. Each time felt riskier than the last, but the thrill of it only seemed to fuel the fire between us. One night, Luca texted me with an address and a simple message: "Come." I knew I shouldn't. Ethan was home, sitting in the living room watching TV. But as I sat beside him, pretending to be engrossed in a book, I couldn't stop thinking about Luca. His touch, his kiss, the way he made me feel like the center of the universe. It was a dangerous pull, one I couldn't resist. "I'm going to bed early," I told Ethan, closing the book and standing up. He glanced at me, a small smile on his face. "Long day?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile in return. "I just need some rest." He nodded, turning his attention back to the TV as I headed upstairs. But instead of going to bed, I grabbed my coat and slipped out the back door, my heart pounding as I got into my car. The address Luca had sent me led to a small, secluded cabin on the edge of town. As I pulled up, I saw his car parked outside, and my stomach fluttered with anticipation. I barely had time to knock on the door before it opened, and there he was, pulling me inside. The cabin was dimly lit, the soft glow of a fire casting shadows across the walls. Luca didn't say a word as he guided me to the couch, his hands finding my waist as he pulled me close. Our lips met in a kiss that was both tender and demanding, and I felt myself melting into him once again. The night was a blur of heat and passion, of whispered words and stolen moments that felt too perfect to be real. But as I lay in his arms afterward, staring at the flickering flames, reality began to creep back in. "What are we doing?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Luca tightened his hold on me, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "We're living," he said simply. "For once, we're living." His words struck a chord in me, and I realized he was right. For so long, I had been going through the motions, living a life that felt safe but unfulfilling. With Luca, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. But at what cost? As I drove home in the early hours of the morning, the weight of my actions began to settle on my shoulders. I slipped into the house as quietly as I could, hoping Ethan wouldn't wake up. But as I climbed into bed beside him, the guilt was almost too much to bear. I told myself it would be the last time, that I couldn't keep living this double life, betraying the man who had stood by me for so long. But deep down I knew it was a lie. The pull of Luca was too strong, the connection between us too intense to simply walk away from. And so the cycle continued. Stolen moments, secret rendezvous, and a growing web of lies that threatened to unravel everything I had built. Each time, I told myself it would be the last. Each time, I believed it just a little less. But no secret stays hidden forever, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down around me. The days began to blur together, a haze of guilt and longing that followed me wherever I went. At home, I played the role of the devoted wife, sitting beside Ethan at dinner and pretending that everything was fine. But inside, I was a storm of emotions, torn between the life I had built and the fire that Luca had ignited within me. At work, things were no better. Every glance, every brush of his hand, every whispered word from Luca was a reminder of what we had done, what we continued to do. The tension between us was palpable, and I was certain that someone would notice. But if they did, no one said a word. One evening, as I was leaving the office, Luca appeared at my side. His expression was serious, his usual smirk replaced with something darker. "Come with me," he said, his voice low. I hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "Luca, I can't. I need to go home." "Please," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Just for a little while." I knew I should say no. I should go home to Ethan and pretend that none of this was happening. But the way Luca looked at me, the desperation in his voice, made it impossible to refuse. We ended up at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, a place where no one would recognize us. As we sat across from each other, the weight of our situation settled heavily between us. "I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not fair to Ethan. It's not fair to anyone." Luca reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "Do you love him?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Did I love Ethan? Or had our marriage become nothing more than a habit, a comfortable routine that I was too afraid to disrupt? "I don't know," I admitted, the truth tasting bitter on my tongue. Luca's gaze softened, and he squeezed my hand. "I know what we're doing is wrong, but you can't deny what we have. It's real, isn't it?" I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. "It's real, but that doesn't make it right." He leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "Sometimes the right thing and the real thing aren't the same." As the weeks went on, our affair grew more reckless. We no longer confined ourselves to the shadows, stealing kisses in the parking garage or meeting in secluded corners of the city. We began taking risks. Long lunches together, late nights at his apartment. Each time felt like a gamble, a dangerous game that we were bound to lose. And yet I couldn't stop. Luca was like a drug, and I was hopelessly addicted. He made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. Desire, passion, excitement. With him, I was alive in a way I never had been before. But the lies were starting to catch up with me. Ethan was growing suspicious, his questions becoming more pointed. "Why are you working so late?" he asked one evening as I came through the door, my hair still damp from the rain. "Deadlines," I replied, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." He studied me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. "You've been different lately. Is everything okay?" My heart raced as I nodded, praying that he wouldn't push further. "Of course, I've just been stressed, that's all." He didn't seem convinced, but he let it go, for now. The turning point came on a rainy Friday evening. Luca had convinced me to come over, promising a quiet night in. But as I stood in his apartment, the city lights casting a soft glow through the windows, I realized that there was nothing quiet about what we were doing. "You're thinking too much," Luca said, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. I leaned back against him, closing my eyes as his warmth enveloped me. "I can't help it." He turned me to face him, his hands resting on my hips. "Then stop. Just be here, with me." His lips found mine, and for a moment I let myself forget. I forgot about Ethan, about the life I had left waiting for me at home. All that mattered was Luca, and the way he made me feel. But the illusion shattered when my phone buzzed on the counter. I pulled away, my heart sinking as I saw Ethan's name on the screen. "Don't answer it," Luca said, his voice firm. "I have to," I replied, reaching for the phone. Ethan's voice was tense when I answered. "Where are you?" I hesitated, the lie already forming in my mind. "Still at the office. I'll be home soon." There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment I thought he might believe me. But then he spoke again, his voice cold and sharp. "I know you're not at the office." My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "I'm outside your office, waiting for you, and you're not here." Panic set in as I realized the gravity of the situation. He knew, or at least he suspected, and there was no way I could explain my way out of this. "I have to go," I said, hanging up before he could respond. Luca watched me, his expression unreadable. "What's going on?" "Get outside my office," I said, my voice trembling. He knows." The drive home was a blur. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more terrifying than the last. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grip the steering wheel. Ethan was waiting for me in the living room, his arms crossed and his expression stony. "Where were you?" he demanded as soon as I walked through the door. "I told you I was—" "Don't lie to me," he interrupted, his voice rising. "I went to your office. I waited there for over an hour. You weren't there." My heart pounded as I tried to come up with an excuse, but nothing came. The truth was written all over my face, and Ethan saw it. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice shaking with anger. "Tell me." I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Tears streamed down my face as I stood there, paralyzed by guilt and shame. Ethan shook his head, his eyes filled with a pain that cut me to my core. "I trusted you. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Sorry?" he repeated, his voice breaking. "Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it." The fallout was devastating. Ethan moved out the next day, leaving me alone in the house that had once been our home. I tried to call him to explain, but he wouldn't answer. I was left to sit with the weight of my actions, the consequences of my choices. Luca reached out a few times, but I ignored his calls. Whatever we had shared was over. It had to be. I couldn't keep running from the wreckage of my life, pretending that everything would be okay. In the end, I was left with nothing but regret. Regret for the choices I had made, the lives I had destroyed, and the love I had taken for granted. The air in the house was suffocating, heavy with silence and tension that neither Ethan nor I knew how to break. After he left that night, the emptiness swallowed me whole. Each hour ticked by like a lifetime, and the weight of my choices settled deeper into my chest. My phone buzzed on the table, a lifeline from Luca, but I ignored it. I couldn't face him. Not now. Not after the chaos I'd unleashed. But the respite was short-lived. A knock at the door startled me, and when I opened it, Ethan stood there, drenched from the rain, his eyes wild with emotion. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. I stepped aside to let him in, unsure of what to expect. He paced the living room, his shoes leaving muddy prints on the hardwood floor, but he didn't seem to notice. His hands were trembling, and when he finally stopped, he turned to me with a look that made my stomach drop. "I saw him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw you with him." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. There was no point in denying it. The truth was written all over my face. "How long?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How long have you been lying to me?" Tears welled in my eyes as I tried to find the words. "Ethan, How long?" he repeated, his voice rising. "Months," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop it. He staggered back as if I had physically struck him. "Months?" he echoed, his voice filled with disbelief. "How could you do this to me? To us?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said, my voice trembling. It happened." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "That's your excuse? It just happened?" "It wasn't like that," I protested. "I didn't go looking for it. You didn't go looking for it?" he interrupted, his eyes blazing with anger. "You expect me to believe that? You didn't just accidentally end up in his arms?" I flinched at his words, the truth of them cutting deeper than I cared to admit. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this," he said, his voice cold. "Sorry doesn't undo the lies, the betrayal. Do you even realize what you've done?" His words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. I could see the pain in his eyes, the heartbreak that I had caused, and it shattered me. "I didn't want to hurt you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I never wanted any of this." "But you did it anyway," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a raw edge. "You made a choice. You chose him." As Ethan's words settled over me, the reality of what I had done became impossible to ignore. I had destroyed everything: our marriage, our trust, our future. And for what? A fleeting connection, a momentary escape from a life that I had taken for granted. The silence between us stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Ethan turned away, his shoulders slumping, as if the weight of everything was too much to bear. "I can't do this," he said finally, his voice hollow. "I can't be here. I can't look at you." "Please," I said, my voice cracking. "Don't leave. Let's talk about this. We can fix it." He shook his head, his back still turned to me. "Fix it? How do you fix something like this? You shattered us. There's no putting the pieces back together." He moved toward the door, and panic gripped me. "Ethan, wait," I said, reaching out to him. He stopped, his hand on the doorknob. "I loved you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I would have done anything for you, and this is how you repay me?" Tears streamed down my face as I watched him walk out the door. The sound of it closing behind him was like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. The days that followed were a blur. Ethan didn't come home, and I didn't try to reach him. I knew he needed space, and part of me was too afraid of what he might say if I called. I threw myself into work, trying to keep my mind off the wreckage of my personal life. But Luca was always there, a constant reminder of the choices I had made. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk, Luca appeared in the doorway. He looked different, tired, weary. The spark that had once drawn me to him was dimmed, replaced by something heavier. "We need to talk," he said. I nodded, following him to a quiet corner of the office. The tension between us was palpable, and for the first time, I didn't feel the same pull toward him. Instead, I felt a deep, gnawing guilt. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice hesitant. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Ethan came to see me." The words hit me like a freight train. "What?" "He knows," Luca said. "He confronted me, and he's He's not going to let this go. My stomach churned as I processed his words. What did he say? He didn't say much, Luca admitted, but I could see it in his eyes. He's hurt and he's angry, and I don't blame him. Neither did I. Ethan had every right to be furious, to demand answers, but the thought of him going to Luca, of him knowing the full extent of our betrayal, made me feel sick. I think we need to stop this, Luca said, his voice soft. What? I asked, my heart sinking. This, he said, gesturing between us. It's not worth it. We've hurt too many people, and it's only going to get worse. I wanted to argue, to tell him that what we had was real, that it was worth fighting for, but deep down, I knew he was right. The damage had already been done, and there was no salvaging what we had left. Maybe you're right, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Luca reached out, his hand brushing against mine. I'm sorry, he said, for everything. Me too, I said, tears welling in my eyes. And just like that, it was over. We need to talk. I've been thinking about this, he said, his voice steady, though I could hear the strain in it. My heart shattered at his words, but I couldn't argue with them. I had torn us apart, and now all I could do was hope that he would find it in his heart to forgive me. But deep down, I knew it might be too late. The conversation dragged on for hours, each word a reminder of the destruction I had caused. By the end of it, I was left standing there, a broken woman, watching as Ethan gathered his things and prepared to leave. I need time, he said, his voice steady but filled with an emotion I couldn't place. I need time to figure this out. I don't know if there's a way forward for us, but I can't be here right now. I nodded, unable to speak, the tears blurring my vision. I watched him walk out the door, closing it behind him softly. And in that moment, I knew that everything had changed. The days after Ethan left were a blur. I spent most of my time in silence, replaying the events in my head, wondering how it all went so wrong. I tried to reach out to Luca, but I didn't hear back from him. It was as if he, too, had disappeared, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my choices. And as I sat there, staring at the empty room, I realized something. I had been chasing something outside of myself, thinking it would make me feel whole, but all it had done was tear me apart. The affair, the lies, the betrayal, it was all a reflection of my own dissatisfaction with the life I had built. And now I had nothing to show for it. The truth was clear. I had destroyed everything. Ethan, my marriage, my own sense of self. And in the end, I was left alone, trapped in the consequences of my action. The house felt like a mausoleum, each room a reminder of the life I had shattered. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, pressing down on me with the weight of my guilt and regret. Ethan's absence was a constant ache, and though I tried to busy myself with cleaning or organizing, nothing could drown out the empty. He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and hurt. No, you don't, but I need to know why. Why did you do it? Was it me? Was I not enough? The pain in his voice broke me. It wasn't you, I said quickly. You've always been enough, more than enough. It was me. I was selfish and stupid, and I let myself get caught up in something I should have stopped before it started. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. That's not an answer. What made you do it? I took a deep breath, trying to find the words to explain something I barely understood myself. I felt lost, I said finally. Our life, our marriage, it had become so routine, so predictable. I didn't realize how much I needed something to shake me out of that until Luca came along. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But it wasn't real. It was a fantasy. And I let it destroy everything. Ethan's expression softened slightly, but the pain in his eyes didn't fade. Do you love him? The question caught me off guard and I hesitated. Did I love Luca? Or was I in love with the idea of him, the escape he had offered? No, I said finally, my voice steady. I thought I did, but I don't. I love you, Ethan. I always have. He stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe me. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I don't know if that's enough. The days that followed were agonizing. Ethan stayed away, and though we spoke on the phone a few times, the conversations were brief and distant. I poured my energy into therapy, determined to understand why I had made the choices I did. I needed to figure out who I was, what I wanted, and how I had let myself lose sight of the things that truly mattered. Through the sessions, I began to see patterns I hadn't recognized before. I had spent so much of my life trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect employee, the perfect everything that I had neglected my own needs and desires. When Luca came along, he had filled a void I hadn't even realized was there. But instead of addressing the root of the problem, I had let myself be swept away by the illusion of passion and excitement. It was a painful realization, but it was also freeing. For the first time, I was starting to understand myself, and that understanding gave me hope. One evening, weeks after our last conversation, Ethan showed up at the house unannounced. I opened the door, surprised to see him standing there holding a small suitcase. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Of course," I said, stepping aside. He walked into the living room and set the suitcase down, his posture tense. "I've been thinking," he said, turning to face me, "about us, about what we had and what we lost." I nodded, my heart pounding. And I don't know if we can get back to where we were," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But I'm willing to try." The words hit me like a wave, and I felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. "You are?" He nodded, his expression serious. "But it's going to take work, a lot of work, and it won't be easy. I need to be able to trust you again, and that's not something that's going to happen overnight." "I'll do whatever it takes," I said quickly, tears streaming down my face. "I'll go to therapy. I'll be honest with you about everything. I'll do anything." Ethan nodded, his gaze softening. "We'll take it one day at a time." The road to rebuilding our relationship was long and difficult. There were days when it felt like we were making progress, and others when the weight of what had happened threatened to pull us apart again. But we kept going, one step at a time. Therapy became a cornerstone of our journey, both as individuals and as a couple. We talked about the things we had been afraid to say before, the fears and insecurities that had driven us apart. It was painful and raw, but it was also necessary. Luca was no longer a part of my life. I had left the job where we had met, determined to start fresh and put the past behind me. It was a difficult decision, but it was the right one. And slowly, things began to change. The love that had once felt broken beyond repair began to mend, piece by piece. It wasn't the same as it had been before. There were scars that would never fully fade. But it was real, and it was ours. As I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, Ethan joined me, a cup of coffee in his hand. He sat beside me, and for a moment we were both silent, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. "I never thought we'd get here," he said finally, his voice soft. "Neither did I admitted. He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "But I'm glad we did." I looked at him, my heart full of gratitude and love. Me too. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized that though the road had been painful, it had led us to a place of understanding and growth, a place where we could begin again. The days turned into weeks, and though Ethan had decided to try rebuilding our marriage, the path forward was anything but smooth. Every moment between us felt like walking on eggshells, each word and action weighted with the past. We were like strangers, cautiously navigating a fragile truce, both aware that the slightest misstep could shatter everything we were trying to salvage. The mornings were the hardest. Ethan and I had once had a routine, a quiet dance of coffee cups and brief kisses before parting for the day. Now, the silence between us was oppressive, and I couldn't help but feel the gaping chasm that had formed where our intimacy used to be. One morning, as I poured coffee into his favorite mug, I tried to break the silence. "Do you want me to cook dinner tonight? Maybe we could eat together, talk?" Ethan glanced up from his phone, his expression unreadable. "Sure," he said after a long pause. "That might be nice." It wasn't much, but it was something. Therapy became our lifeline. Every week, we sat in a quiet room with a soft-spoken therapist who guided us through the wreckage of our marriage. At first, the sessions were brutal, raw, unfiltered conversations about the affair, the lies, and the pain I had caused. Ethan was unflinchingly honest, laying bare the anger and betrayal that simmered beneath his calm exterior. "I can't stop replaying it in my head," he admitted during one session, his voice tight with emotion. "The thought of her with him, it's like a poison I can't get rid of." Hearing him say it out loud felt like a knife to my chest. I had done that to him, placed images in his mind that would haunt him forever. But as much as it hurt to hear, I knew it was necessary. If we were going to move forward, we had to confront the truth, no matter how painful it was. "I hate what I did to you," I said, my voice trembling. "I hate that I hurt you in ways I can't take back, but I'm here, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right." Our therapist nodded, her gaze shifting between us. "Rebuilding trust takes time. It's not about forgetting what happened, it's about learning to live with it and finding a way to move forward together." Outside of therapy, I worked tirelessly to prove to Ethan that I was committed to rebuilding our relationship. I deleted all traces of Luca from my life, his number, his messages, even the small mementos that had somehow made their way into my home. I wanted to erase every reminder of the man who had nearly destroyed us. But erasing him from my life didn't erase the memories. There were nights when I lay awake, consumed by the weight of my guilt. I would stare at the ceiling, wondering if Ethan would ever truly forgive me, or if the ghost of my betrayal would always linger between us. One night, as we sat in the living room watching a movie, I felt the familiar tension creeping in. Ethan was sitting on the far end of the couch, his body language closed off. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance between us, but I didn't know how. "Do you ever think about us?" I asked hesitantly, breaking the silence. He glanced at me, his expression guarded. "What do you mean?" "About how we used to be, before all of this." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the screen. "Yeah, I do. A lot." "Do you think we can ever get back to that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I want to believe we can, but it's hard. Every time I look at you, I see him." His words were a punch to the gut, but I didn't blame him for being honest. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to say it enough, but I am." Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "I know you are, and I know you're trying. It's just going to take time." Time became both our ally and our enemy. As the weeks turned into months, the intensity of the pain began to fade, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. Ethan and I started spending more time together, cooking dinner, going for walks, even laughing at old jokes that we hadn't thought about in years. But there were still moments of doubt, moments when the weight of what had happened threatened to pull us under. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan turned to me. "Do you ever think about him?" he asked, his voice quiet. The question caught me off guard, but I didn't hesitate. "No," I said firmly. "Not anymore. He was a mistake, a horrible, selfish mistake. You're the one I want, Ethan. You always have been." He studied me for a long moment, as if searching for the truth in my words. Finally, he nodded. "I believe you." It was the first time he had said those words since the affair, and hearing them felt like a small victory. As the months passed, I began to see glimmers of the relationship we had once shared. There were moments of laughter, moments of tenderness, moments that reminded me why I had fallen in love with Ethan in the first place. But there were also moments of pain, moments when the past threatened to rear its ugly head. One night, as we lay in bed, Ethan turned to me. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I hesitated, knowing how important my answer was. "I regret everything about it," I said. "I regret the lies, the betrayal, the pain I caused you. But more than anything, I regret that I let myself lose sight of what we had." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I regret not seeing the signs," he admitted. "I should have noticed that something was wrong. Maybe if I had, things would have been different." "It wasn't your fault," I said quickly. "None of this was your fault." "Maybe not," he said. "But I still wonder." We fell silent, the weight of the conversation settling over us, but as I reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The road to healing was long and difficult, but slowly we began to rebuild. Therapy helped us navigate the challenges, and over time the wounds began to heal. We started to trust each other again, little by little, and though the scars of the past would always remain, they no longer defined us. One evening, as we sat at the dining table sharing a bottle of wine, Ethan raised his glass. "To us," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "For surviving the storm." "To us," I echoed, my heart swelling with gratitude. As our glasses clinked, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. We had been through hell, but we had come out on the other side stronger, more resilient, and more in love than ever. The journey hadn't been easy, and it was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hope that we could move forward together and build a future that was even stronger than the past we had left behind. This completes another 1,500 words. Let me know if you'd like to continue or adjust any part of the story. You said 1,000. ChatGPT said, continuing with the next 1,000 words, this segment will explore the protagonist and Ethan's continued progress in healing and reflect on how they begin to redefine their relationship moving forward. The weeks continued to stretch out, each one filled with small moments that felt like victories. Ethan and I weren't the same people we had been before the affair, and maybe that was a good thing. We were rawer, more vulnerable, and yet somehow, that vulnerability brought a sense of authenticity to our interactions that we had been missing for years. There were still setbacks, of course. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. There were moments when I could see the doubt flicker in Ethan's eyes, moments when his expression darkened, as if he was reliving the pain all over again. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between, and I clung to the hope that one day they would disappear entirely. One Saturday afternoon, as we worked together to clean out the garage, Ethan found an old photo album buried in a dusty box. He flipped through the pages silently, his fingers brushing over the edges of the pictures. I watched him from across the room, wondering what memories the images were stirring within him. "Do you remember this?" he asked, holding up a picture of the two of us on our honeymoon. We were sitting on a beach, laughing as the waves crashed against the shore behind us. I walked over, peering at the photo over his shoulder. "I do," I said softly. "We spent half the day trying to build that sandcastle. And it collapsed right as we finished," he added, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I smiled too, the memory warming me. You said it was symbolic of how fleeting beauty can be. I think I rolled my eyes at you. You did, he said, laughing softly. You thought I was being dramatic. You were, I teased gently. He set the album down and turned to me, his expression serious. I miss that, he said. I miss us. I do too, I admitted, my voice trembling. But we can get there again. I know we can. He nodded, his gaze searching mine. I hope you're right. As the months passed, I began to notice a shift in Ethan. He started to let his guard down, allowing himself to be vulnerable with me in ways he hadn't before. He would open up about his feelings, sharing the pain and anger he had bottled up for so long. It wasn't easy to hear, but I welcomed it. Every conversation felt like another brick in the foundation we were rebuilding. One night, as we lay in bed, Ethan turned to me. Do you think we're stronger now than we were before? He asked, his voice thoughtful. I considered his question carefully. I think we're more honest, I said. We've been forced to confront things we never talked about before, and that's made us stronger in some ways. He nodded, his expression contemplative. I still have moments when I think about it, when I wonder if I'll ever be able to fully move on. I understand, I said softly, and I don't expect you to forget, but I hope you'll be able to forgive. He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. I'm trying, he said, and I think I'm getting there. Our journey wasn't just about healing as a couple, it was also about healing individually. Therapy had opened my eyes to the ways I had neglected myself, the patterns of behavior that had led me to seek fulfillment outside of my marriage. I began to focus on finding happiness within myself, rediscovering hobbies and interests that had once brought me joy. Ethan, too, began to explore his own identity outside of our relationship. He started running again, something he had loved in college but had abandoned over the years. Watching him come alive in new ways was both inspiring and humbling. It reminded me that our relationship was made up of two individuals, each with their own needs and desires. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the stars, Ethan spoke up. I've been thinking about taking a solo trip, he said, just for a few days, to clear my head. I felt a pang of fear at the thought of being apart, but I pushed it aside. I think that's a great idea, I said. You deserve some time for yourself. Are you sure? He asked, his brow furrowed. I don't want you to think I'm running away. I don't, I said, reaching for his hand. I think it's important for both of us to have space to grow, and I trust you. The words felt significant as they left my mouth. It was the first time I had said them since the affair, and I realized that I meant them. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, but it was something we were working toward, one moment at a time. The days leading up to Ethan's trip were filled with quiet anticipation. I could see the excitement in his eyes as he planned his itinerary, and it warmed my heart to see him reclaiming a piece of himself. On the morning of his departure, I helped him pack his bag, slipping a small note inside when he wasn't looking. As he stood by the door, his bag slung over his shoulder, he turned to me. Thank you, he said, his voice sincere, for supporting me. Always, I said, giving him a small smile. He hesitated for a moment before stepping closer and pulling me into a hug. It was the kind of embrace we hadn't shared in months, tight, warm, and filled with unspoken emotion. I'll call you when I get there, he said, pulling back just enough to look me in the eyes. I'll be here, I said. As I watched him drive away, I felt a mix of emotions, sadness at his absence, hope for the future, and a deep sense of gratitude for the progress we had made. Our journey was far from over, but we were on the right path, and that was enough. That evening, as I sat alone in the quiet house, I found myself reflecting on the past year, the pain, the mistakes, the lessons. It had all brought us to this moment. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I was willing to fight for us, for Ethan, for myself, and for the life we